Hi Year 6 and welcome to Reading for Pleasure with me. I am going to carry on reading 10 True Tales, Titanic Young Survivors by Alan Zolo. So let's find out which survivor we are learning about today.
So this chapter is called Father is Never Coming Home, and it's a story of the survivor John Jack Ryerson. 13-year-old John Jack Ryerson was looking forward to another fantastic day in Paris with his family when the tragic news struck like a crackling thunderbolt. His big brother, Arthur Jr., a 20-year-old Yale student, had been killed in a car crash outside of Philadelphia. Jack suffered the same shock and disbelief as his parents, retired millionaire attorney Arthur Ryerson Sr. and Emily Ryerson, and his sisters, Susan 21 and Emily 18. Another sister, Ellen, was at a boarding school in Maryland. Up until the awful morning, the day after Easter, April the 8th, 1912, the Ryersons had been enjoying a marvellous vacation. In February, they had closed up their mansion in Haverford, Pennsylvania, and left on an extended tour of Europe. Travelling with them were Jack's tutor, Grace Bowen, and Mrs. Ryerson's personal French maid, Victorine Chaudanson, who was also helping the girls brush up on their French. One of the reasons for the trip was for Susan and Emily to meet some of Europe's eligible and preferably wealthy bachelors and size them up as possible future husbands. The Ryersons were staying at the elegant Hotel Langham in Paris when the cable arrived informing them of Arthur Jr.'s death. He had been riding in an open car driven by his pal John Hoffman, who was also a Yale student born into a rich, prominent family in the countryside. Unexpectedly, John lost control of the car. It careened into a ditch and slammed into a telegraph pole, hurling both young men over the hood. John's head struck the pole while Arthur was thrown against a fence post. Both died later that evening. As they coped with their grief, Jack's parents made plans to return home on the first available ship leaving for New York. That would be the Titanic. They booked first-class passage on the vessel, which was scheduled to arrive on Wednesday, April the 17th. The funeral service was slated for Friday at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, with a burial in the family plot overlooking Otsego Lake near their summer estate Ringwood, outside of Cooperstown, New York. Jack was shrouded in a mental fog. He couldn't believe that his big brother was dead. The boy always looked up to him and relished his visits home from college. It was hard for Jack to fathom there would be no more golf lessons from Arthur, no more wrestling each other out on the lawn, no more playing doubles together on the tennis court. At the hotel, Jack gathered up his books and schoolwork for the trip home. Miss Bowen and Victorine hastily packed the family's clothing, personal items and the bed linens. The next morning, 16 steamer trunks were ready for transport. Everyone in the group was dressed in sombre morning clothes, with Jack and his father each wearing a black armband. They boarded the train Transatlantique for the 6-hour trip to Cherbourg, France, the first of 2 stops by the Titanic. On the train, the Ryersons met by chance several socially prominent friends who had booked passage on the Titanic after wintering in Europe. Among them were Colonel John Jacob Astor IV and his new teenage wife Madeline, and wealthy Philadelphians John and Marion Thayer and George and Eleanor Nellie Widener. The friends were stunned and saddened to learn of Arthur Jr.'s death. The following evening, the group stepped aboard the tender Nomadic, which ferried them out to the great ship anchored in the Cherbourg harbour. The Titanic, in all its majesty, awed Jack, offering him a momentary respite from his sorrow. Set against a spectacular purple and gold sunset, the towering vessel sparkled with thousands of lights from bow to stern. On board, the Ryersons were greeted by J. Bruce Ismay, head of the White Star Line. After extending his condolences, he gave them their own personal steward and another stateroom in addition to the 2 they had already booked. Their suites on the starboard side of B deck provided them with 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms and 4 large walk-in closets. Jack shared a room with Emily, Miss Bowen stayed with Susan, and Mr. and Mrs. Ryerson had their own suite. Victorine was given a room down the hall. Jack spent the next few days exploring the ship and using the gymnasium, which was open to children every afternoon from 1 to 3 p.m. As a diversion from their grief, he and his sisters sometimes played shuffleboard or quoits, a ring toss game. Jack worried about his mother, who remained in deep mourning and rarely left her stateroom. At mealtimes, while the rest of the family ate in the dining saloon, Mrs. Ryson stayed in her suite, nibbling at the food the steward brought to her on a silver tray. "Mother, please won't you come with me and see this grand ship?" Jack asked. "It has so many splendid things." "Jack, it's better if I stay put," she replied. "I know many people on this ship and I really don't want to see any of them just now. They will be very sympathetic and then they will engage in small talk. I just couldn't bear that. It wouldn't be proper." He was relieved that his father had at least convinced her to go for nightly walks. Wearing a black veil around her feathered hat, Mrs. Ryson would hook her arm around her husband's and go for a long stroll every night when the decks were nearly deserted. On Sunday morning, Jack, his sisters and his father attended a church service held in the first-class dining saloon. The boy choked up when he saw his father, a man of strong faith, moved to tears during the singing of the hymn, "O God, our help in ages past." That night, Jack and Emily were sound asleep when their mother pounded on the door and shouted, "Emily! Jack! Wake up! Get dressed immediately!" Mrs. Ryson then roused Sarah, Susan and Miss Bowen from bed before running down the hall to wake Victorine. Jack quickly dressed, but Emily was still so sleepy she could barely get out of bed. When their mother returned, she scolded Emily. "You're so slow! Don't bother putting on a dress! There's not enough time!" "Just put on your fur coat right over your nightgown like I've done and bring your life jacket. Hurry!" "Mother, what's the matter?" Jack asked. "There's talk that we've struck an iceberg. Captain Smith has ordered all passengers to report to the boat deck right away." When the Ryson group gathered in the hallway, Mr. Ryson checked the straps on all their life jackets. Then he led them down the corridor to the grand staircase and up to the port side of the boat deck, where they were joined by the Thayers, Wideners, Astors, and William and Lucille Carter and their two children, Billy and Lucille. They were assigned to Lifeboat 4, but it wasn't ready because of unexpected delays. The deck was listing to port and the bow was sinking by the minute. While the lifeboats carrying women and children were being lowered into the water, the group stood around in the cold, assaulted by the noise of the roaring steam vents. These rich and powerful people had been used to giving orders their whole lives, but on this night they patiently waited for instructions on where to go. While they worried, Jack was enthralled by the flares being fired into the sky to attract any ships that might be in the area. The flares reminded him of the fireworks on the 4th of July over Estago Lake. Colonel Astor tried to assure everyone that there was little danger. "Even if, for some unimaginable reason, the Titanic can't stay afloat," he said, "I have been informed that the Olympic and the Baltic are on the way to give assistance. They will remove those of us who don't get into lifeboats." Finally, at about 1:30 a.m, the group was ordered down to the promenade deck where the loading of number 4 began. The wealthy women and their maids, mothers from third class clutching their babies, women and children from Lebanon and Sweden. Wives kissed their husbands and stepped into the boat. Eventually, it was the Ryersons' turn, but Jack's mother balked. "Why must I go in that boat?" she asked her husband. "Please, let me stay with you." "Now, Emily," he replied, "you must follow orders. I'll remain with John Thayer. We'll be all right." "Let the others go first," she said. Jack's father helped Miss Bowen into the boat, then he kissed and hugged his two daughters before assisting Victorine. "Please take my place in the boat, Mr. Ryerson," the maid said. "If I died, who would mourn?" "Thank you, Victorine, but you're not going to die, and I will not take your place in the boat." He then handed her off to Second Officer Charles Lightiller, who was in charge of the loading. Next in line was Jack, who was standing in front of his mother. Jack hugged his father and started to climb into the boat when Lightiller declared, "He can't go, women and children only." Jack's father grabbed Lightiller by the arm and turned him so they were nose to nose. Speaking from the deep anguish of a father who had just lost a son and wasn't about to risk losing another, Mr. Ryerson asserted, "Of course that boy goes with his mother. He's only 13 years old." Intimidated by Mr. Ryerson's intensity, the officer nodded and let Jack climb in. Trying to regain his authority, Lightiller announced, "No more boys!" From his seat next to Miss Brown in the stern, Jack watched his parents embrace and kiss each other before his mother entered number 4. In her haste, she fell awkwardly over several other women who were already in the boat. Regaining her balance, she scrambled to a seat in the bow beside Susan. Victorine and Emily had taken their places in the middle of the boat near Marion Thayer and Madeline Astor. It was almost 2 a.m. Even though the boat was only half full, Lightella ordered it lower. Jack and his sisters waved to their father, who was standing by the railing with Thea, Asta and Widener. Mr. Ryerson waved back and smiled. Jack noticed how far the ship had sunk already. The deck used to be 60 feet above the waterline, but was now less than 20 feet from the surface. He saw water rushing in through open portals of the deluxe suites on B and C decks. He watched deck chairs, doors and casks being hurled off the decks from above, objects meant for people to cling on to after they jumped or fell into the water. There were only 2 seamen in the lifeboat, so Marion Thayer, Madeline Astor, Lucia Carter and other women in the middle pulled on the oars. As number 4 moved away from the ship, Quartermaster Walter Perkis, who was in charge of the lifeboat, yelled, "She's going! Pull for your lives, or they'll be sucked under!" Everyone who was by an oar, including Emily and Victorine, rowed with all the strength they could muster. Within a few cruel minutes, the Titanic was no more. Suddenly the black water was teeming with drowning, freezing people shrieking for help. "We need to go back and save those poor souls," Mrs. Ryerson shouted. "No," countered others in the lifeboat. "They'll capsize us." "We absolutely must," Mrs. Ryerson insisted. "Our husbands could be dying out there." Perkis ordered number 4 to turn around, and they began hauling waterlogged, freezing men aboard. Some were barely conscious. As each man was pulled in, the women rubbed his numb, ice-cold arms and legs to increase circulation. Jack kept wondering if the next person they saved would be his father, or the next, or the next. The boy figured that if his father hadn't made it into a lifeboat, he was probably still alive because he was a strong swimmer. For a 61-year-old, Mr. Ryerson was extremely fit, but after a dozen men, all crew members, were rescued, no more survivors were found. The anxiety over his father's fate heightened when 2 of the men they had plucked out of the icy water died within the first hour. Jack knew then that without a lifeboat, there was no hope. Seeing how downcast he was, Miss Bowen tried to interest him in the sky. "Oh, Jack, have you ever seen so many beautiful stars?" she asked. "They seem so big and bright, it's almost as though you could reach out and touch them. Look, there's the Big Dipper. And over there, see those 3 bright stars in a row? They form Orion's belt." She kept pointing out different constellations and telling him the legends behind the names. Jack and the others suffered through the brutally cold night in a daze, dumbfounded by the tragedy. Their spirits soared, however, when the rescue ship, Carpathia, came into view at dawn. It took another 2 hours before they were brought aboard. When Jack stepped foot on the deck, he was given hot chocolate. Never had a drink tasted so good to him. Wrapped in warm blankets, he and his sisters began to thaw out. But his mother remained in her frost-covered fur coat, her hands gripping the railing, her eyes scanning each arriving lifeboat for her husband. Jack and his sisters watched too. When the last man from the last lifeboat came aboard, Mrs. Ryerson nearly collapsed. Emotionally drained and exhausted, she was led from the railing by her children. Slumped in a chair, she refused to accept that her husband was dead. "He must have been picked up by another ship," she told her children. "He's still alive, I just know it." Jack desperately wanted to believe her. He had already lost a brother. He didn't want to lose a father too. After a short memorial service over the spot where the Titanic went down, the Carpathia steamed for New York. During the 4-day trip, the ship endured fog, thunderstorms and heavy seas, which only added to the misery of the survivors, hundreds of whom were now widowed. Despite her grief, Mrs. Ryerson felt the pain and suffering of those survivors who lost everything but their lives. So she, Mrs. Widener, Mrs. Thayer and Mrs. Astor, who had all lost their husbands, agreed to set up a special fund for penniless survivors. The wealthy women promised to make their contributions once they landed in New York. By the time the Carpathia docked Thursday night, Jack had accepted his father's death. Waiting for the Ryersons was his youngest sister, Ellen, who had brought extra coats and wraps for everyone. When she saw her brother, she rushed up and hugged him. "You're alive!" she squealed. "The newspaper this morning counted you and father among the dead. Does this mean he's alive too?" Jack shook his head glumly and said, "Father is never coming home." Holding his mother's hand, Jack walked with her and his sisters to a waiting limousine which whisked them to the Hotel Belmont. A personal shopper for the family then bought each of them proper morning clothes, which were delivered to the hotel. On Sunday morning, the Ryersons attended St Thomas Church, where the Reverend Ernest Stiers paid tribute to Colonel Astor and Arthur Ryerson Sr. Later that week, the family accompanied the body of Arthur Jr. to Cooperstown for burial. The casket containing Arthur Jr.'s body rested on a bank of greens and flowers on a farm wagon from Ringwood and was drawn by a pair of horses. The long line of carriages bearing mourners and family friends passed through the small town. On Main Street, the curtains of the storefronts were drawn and flags were at half-staff in sympathy of the Ryersons. The Vested Choir of Christ Church sang Alleluia while the body was being lowered into the grave at Lakewood Cemetery. Jack, his sisters and mother had finally carried out the heart-rending mission that had caused them to take the ill-fated Titanic. Arthur Ryerson Sr.'s body was never recovered. 2 years after the Titanic tragedy, Jack and his mother went on an 8-month trip around the world. After graduating from Yale, Jack made golf his passion. He played in 425 amateur tournaments throughout the 1930s and 1940s, and eventually golfed on more than 1,400 different courses. In the early 1960s, he deeded the Ringwood estate of 28 rooms and 37 acres to the Episcopal Church to use as a youth centre. He waited until he was 54 before he married and settled in Palm Beach, Florida, where he died at age 87 in 1986. He seldom talked about the Titanic. Jack is buried in the Ryerson family plot in Lakewood Cemetery. To ease her grief over the death of her husband, Mrs. Emily Ryerson threw herself into charity work. During World War I, she raised money for wounded French soldiers and fatherless children and was awarded one of France's highest honours, the Croix de Guerre. As a tribute to Arthur Jr., she endowed a Yale scholarship in his name to be awarded annually to a student who exhibits good character and exceptional promise. She travelled on goodwill trips on behalf of President Herbert Hoover and helped raise money for the European Children's Relief Fund. In 1927, she married Forsyth Chavez, a financial advisor to the Chinese government. The couple, who had a villa on the French Riviera, travelled the world. Emily Ryerson Chavez died of a heart attack at age 76 in Uruguay in 1939. She is buried in the Ryerson family plot. Jack's sister Susan, who attended the University of Chicago, worked at an army field hospital in France during World War I. For weeks while transporting the wounded in her ambulance, she was under constant enemy fire. Like her mother, Susan was awarded the Croix de Guerre. She married Lieutenant George Patterson, an American war hero who was also a recipient of the medal, and moved to Morristown, New Jersey. Tragically, Susan died in 1921 at age 30 from complications caused by appendicitis. She is buried in the Ryersons family plot. Jack's sister Emily was married twice and had 7 children. She lived at Ringwood until her death in 1960 at age 66. She is buried in the Ryerson family plot. In a tragic twist of fate, her grandson, Christopher Coulson, was a student at Yale who was killed in a car accident while home on holiday vacation, just like Arthur Jr. 2 months after the Titanic disaster, the Ryersons' maid, Victorine Chowdanson, married the family's chauffeur, Henry Perkins. They spent most of their lives in New York. She died in 1962 at age 86. Jack's tutor, Grace Bowen, devoted the rest of her life to teaching in the Cooperstown area. She was 78 when she died in 1945. And that's the end of Reading for Pleasure today. I hope you found that story and that tale of that survivor really interesting. I know I did. Okay, see you tomorrow, everyone. Bye-bye.